Great. A lot of folks we haven't seen in a while have been away, so good to have everybody here today. Just a couple of housekeeping things, and then I'll introduce Max and we'll get going. So we are going to videotape today, so this will be posted on the YouTube channel, whatever.
Yes.
It'll be posted. So when you ask questions, which we certainly welcome, just speak loudly so the cameras can pick them up. We won't swivel the camera to you, but we hopefully will hear your voice as you go along. And then the slides from today will also make available, so don't feel like you can take copious notes or those kinds of things. So with that, I'm going to introduce Max Schmeiser, who's from the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Some of you may remember he actually was here for a while, so he's still one of us, so to speak, and be presenting work that actually I've worked with him on. But he is at the board, so as opposed to one of the regional type banks, and he's working now on the survey of consumer finances, which is an important survey for a lot of us who study issues of assets and wealth over the lifespan. And so he's spending the next few days talking with folks around campus, around his research and his work and ability to work on different kinds of data sets available to the Fed. And he's also teaching a course in the Consumer Science Department this spring as part of the Consumer in the Market course. So it's a virtual course. It'll be it'll be a blended learning course with him doing a lot of his lectures from DC. So we are thankful for him for playing that role for us as well. So with that, I will hand it over to you. Just in terms of logistics today, you're welcome to ask questions anytime, sort of econ style seminar. We just have an hour, so at some point Max may have to hurry up to get through the rest of his content, but we certainly are open to any comments as we go along. So.
All right, thank you, Michael. So it's wonderful to see you all. It's been I've been filled with nostalgia just wandering around. And it's so fun to see all these buildings that were under construction when I was here are now finished. And so I finally get to walk around this whole building. I did a 4x4 tour this morning to see everything. So it's been very nice being back. So thank you for having me. And as Michael said, he's actually on this project, as is Carly Urban, who some of you know. She was an econ PhD student several years back. And then Alex Brown, a colleague of mine at the Federal Reserve Board. And of course, with my new job, I don't just say whatever I want. I have to actually say that the views expressed are those of myself and my co-authors, and not those of the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve System, or NUR staff, aside from myself. And so with that, so is this actually the CFS group, or so everyone here, some relation to financial literacy, so you're probably fairly familiar with the importance of financial literacy. And in general, the reason we're concerned is because it's relatively low across the US, especially for young adults. They appear to be particularly weak in terms of financial knowledge and financial abilities. According to Honoré Lusardi and Olivia Mitchell, less than a third of Americans ages 23 to 28 have basic knowledge of interest rates, inflation risk, and diversification. These are the big three questions that Honoré has managed to get on most surveys out there now. In fact, we're looking at adding them or some variation thereof onto the Survey of Consumer Finances for 2016. So just based on those questions, relatively financially illiterate population. And it wouldn't normally matter, except that these questions, the response to these questions have actually been associated with all sorts of financial outcomes: lower rates of planning for retirement, asset accumulation, less stock market participation. We also have greater use of high-cost financial services like payday loans and check cashers, and then higher levels of debt overall among this population who have low financial literacy. So it's actually of significant concern to those of us who care about financial well-being of people in general and low-income populations in particular. And so in terms of a policy response to this low financial literacy, well, it became crystal clear as a result of the financial crisis we had that was largely driven by consumer financial decisions, mainly the housing market, that we really need to focus more on expanding financial literacy and helping consumers to make better financial choices. And one response of many, including additional regulation and so on, has been to expand K-12 personal financial and economic education in schools. So requiring, mandating that schools in states across the country actually implement some kind of personal financial education, economic education, and so on to help improve the financial skills of young people. Now, this was done despite the fact that the existing body of research, just in general in the financial literacy field and financial education field, yields conflicting findings at best in terms of the effectiveness of financial education. Now, this is for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into in further detail, but just in general, there wasn't a lot of solid research showing if we give people financial education in high school, it's actually going to lead to much better financial outcomes 5 years down the road. And so what we're going to do in this paper is use a relatively novel approach to examine the effect of very specific high school financial education mandates in 3 states and their effect on the young people in those states. So just a brief review of some literature. So Anita Brown, a colleague of mine at the New York Fed, her and her colleagues have a paper where they're looking more broadly at economic math and personal finance education. They're actually using the same data set that we are and looking at a somewhat similar population, young adults. And they're finding that, just in terms of comparison to some other papers that are out there, so they find some effect of financial education on credit scores in terms of increasing them, reduction in credit card delinquency, auto delinquency, and so on. They find some weird findings though, like economic education appears to increase the amount of debt people accumulate, and math increases, the more math you take increases the probability you apply for bankruptcy or file for bankruptcy. So just some odd findings. And we have Sean Cole at Harvard finding no effect really of financial education, some effect of math education on debt accumulation, but this is a very broad population. And then going back a little ways, you have Sharon Tennyson, a paper in the Journal of Consumer Affairs, showing that an increase in financial literacy, basically how people respond to test scores, to tests of financial knowledge when they're given a high school financial course. But this is really a very short-term experiment looking at pre and post some education. Do people actually increase their knowledge? And yes, if they're sort of told that they're going to be tested on the subject. And then Doug Bernheim at Stanford, he had a paper way back, well, in 2001 as well, in the Journal of Public Economics, showing that for an older population, or older than the other groups, 30 to 49, you see an increase in stock market participation and asset accumulation. For people who reported that way back when in high school, I had some kind of financial economic education course. So, but now despite this, sort of limited positive effects in this literature, there's some fundamental flaws with this literature in that they often assume that all personal financial education mandates are equal. I would say to any of you who know anything about state education programs, just even within a state, let alone across states, no curriculum is the same, no instruction is done the same. There's wide variation across states in how they implement education programs, curricula, and how they teach things, and how rigorous it is, how they test, all sorts of things like that. Moreover, you also have a lag between when a state decides, yes, we want to teach personal finance in the classroom. Well, it doesn't happen the day after they pass the legislation. It actually takes a few years for them to develop a curriculum, for it to be taught, the teachers to be trained on this, for it to get into all the school districts, and so on. So it's not that it shows up the day the law passes. It's several years from then when kids are even actually exposed to this education. And moreover, you can pass a law, but not all states are going to mandate that school districts actually teach this. They're not going to enforce this in any way. They're not necessarily going to train their teachers in any way to actually teach this curriculum. And then on top of this, if you're moving other things around, it might be that you change personal finance education or you implement personal finance education, but you also decide you're going to up your math requirements at the same time, or you're going to change English or something else at the same time. And these could potentially confound the effects of financial education if you're changing other things around. And of course, if you ignore these issues, you're going to tend to bias your estimates towards finding no effect of financial education. If you, for example, say that the treatment occurred the day they passed the legislation, well, of course, you're not going to find much of an effect because no kid was actually getting taught financial education the day after the legislature passed this mandate. And so it might be an explanation for why we find very little effect in existing literature. And then just, some other, actually I'll skip over this because I talked about this a little bit and probably won't have as much time as I'd like. So basically what we're going to do, we're going to take a bit of a different approach in that instead of just treating every state that implemented financial education as if they implemented the same education, so we're not going to treat Texas' financial education program the same as Georgia's financial education. We're actually going to look state by state, at least in 3 particular states. And we're going to choose 3 states where they actually had fairly rigorous financial education or personal finance education mandates. They were required courses In 2 cases, there was teacher training. They were needed to graduate, and so actually fairly rigorously implemented. Moreover, by focusing on a couple of states, we're actually able to look at, okay, when did this actually show up in the classroom? We can call people in the state, we can look through state documentation and find out, okay, when did this actually show up? How widely was it implemented? Was there teacher training? What kind of teacher training? Those sorts of things. And in fact, the results of all this digging we've done, FINRA gave us a grant to actually collect this data from all the states. We're going to be posting this online so that other researchers will know what kind of programs various states have. But anyway, so we actually dug into these states in a fair bit of detail. And so one thing, again, we're going to start once kids are actually getting this education. And the next thing is we're going to use a synthetic controls method. In addition to a standard sort of border state model, we're also going to use a synthetic controls method to build a comparison group for each state. Obviously, whenever you're doing a policy sort of natural experiment like this, it's tough to construct the perfect comparison states. We're going to use this synthetic method to construct our comparison state. And basically, we're just going to look at, okay, so what are the effects of these specific personal financial education programs on the early adulthood credit outcomes for those exposed to them. So one of the things that prompted this paper to begin with was simply the variation in how states were reported as, the type of financial education states were reported to have. So if you look at common sources for information on financial education, the Jumpstart Coalition, the Council for Economic Education, the Champlain College Center for Financial Literacy, if you actually do comparisons there, you're going to find differences in what they say about the states. They'll say some states are classified as A, really strong, and another one will say, well, it's sort of moderate. And there's a lot of confusion about what states actually did and when and what the requirements are. And you think this is weird, like why wouldn't they know when Georgia implemented its financial education and whether they have teacher training or not? Well, it's not that simple. I mean, some places might have done it or they didn't document it well, or in some cases we actually had states, not the states we're looking at, but other states where the legislature would pass something, and then between the time the legislature passed something and when it was supposed to go into effect, they actually repealed it. And so it's just, there's a lot of policy changes going on, so it's understandable that there's some confusion as to what exactly is in place in all these different states. And unless you're calling people up and talking to people and digging through all this documentation, you're going to have a tough time figuring this out. And so we actually went to some trouble talking to these people and trying to get a sense for what exactly was going on. So in terms of our 3 states, well, why did we choose them? One reason is that they all had changed their economic in their personal finance education, starting with the graduating class of 2007. This personal finance course was introduced as part of a required high school economics course. They all offered teacher training and a standardized or a model curriculum. That wasn't necessarily what was implemented in schools, but they offered at least some guidance to the teachers in terms of what you should be teaching, a model curriculum. Moreover, they didn't have any changes in mandates for math, other course requirement changes over the same time period. So we could look at just the effect of the personal finance education. And this is just giving you a sense for the rigorousness of the education for in Georgia and Texas, for example. We have 1 year in length in terms of the education, and the students were tested on this as part of their high school graduation requirements. In Idaho, they weren't tested, it was only half a year.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So this was implemented for the class of 2007, so this was not so much a financial crisis response,
Sorry, so these
right?
ones weren't, no.
Okay, I'm just curious then.
No, I did.
I just was curious. So something else prompted each of these states to decide to go ahead
and implement this. And it was done, I mean, it wasn't all implemented in the same, or passed in the same year. I think for Georgia it was 2002, Texas it was, I can't remember when, but they passed in different years and just different legs between when it actually was passed and actually showed up in the school. It just happens they showed up at the same time in the classroom.
Thanks.
So obviously in terms of control states, we need states that obviously don't have these mandates, didn't change their math or economic education curriculum in the same sample period. And so what we're going to do is, instead of trying to pick out individual states ourselves, we're going to use this synthetic controls method for comparative case studies that Abadi has pioneered. And what we do is basically collect a whole bunch of state level data from 2000, GDP, median household income, poverty rate, you'll see the whole host of things there. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and create a synthetic state by weighting all of these characteristics such that we get a match for our treatment state in terms of a combination of some weighted combination of these other states on these characteristics we've outlined. And we're basically going to also assume as part of this that because people were treated in Georgia, it doesn't affect Florida, for example, the students, so there's no spillover effects here. I won't go into much detail on the synthetic controls method, but basically I'll just say that we tried a bunch of different specifications in terms of what we use to construct these synthetic states. It doesn't really matter what we include, we get the same results regardless. But I'll just show you anyway, so this is our treatment states in dark blue, and then the potential control states, basically these were states without any changes going on, that met our criteria for use as comparison states. And then these are the weights we came up with depending on the different specifications. So for example, for Georgia, you can see how the weights in each case are going to sum to 1, and it'll be some combination of a host of different states. And for everything I'm going to show you, we're just going to use specification number 1. I'm just going to show you the results from specification 1. But again, as I said, it doesn't really affect the results of which one we use. 40 minutes. All right. So I was giving this presentation at the AA meetings a couple weeks ago, and I had an 8 o'clock session on a Sunday morning, and I forgot my U.S. geography. So I was bumbling around trying to remember, oh, wait, is that? That's, Washington State, Montana, so on and so forth. So it was rather embarrassing, but happily I brushed up on my U.S. geography and in any event. So what we come up with basically in terms of our final weights is that for Georgia, so for Texas, we use California, and what do we use for Texas? So California, Kentucky, and Mississippi, and then for Idaho, we use Washington, Montana, and so on. So, and then for the border one, this is again just sort of a supplemental analysis we do. We do Texas compared to New Mexico, we do Georgia compared to Florida, and then we do Idaho and compare it to Montana and Wyoming. All right, so in terms of the data set we're using for this, so one of the nice things about the Federal Reserve Board is we have a lot of data. And this very nice data set in particular is the Federal Reserve Board Bank of New York's Consumer Credit Panel. So this is a 5% sample of all US credit files. And it's done by Equifax. And moreover, we also pull the household members of everyone in this sort of primary 5% sample. And when we say household members, we mean everyone with a credit file at your address. So for example, if you live in an apartment building, we get your household members, who happen to be you and your 100 closest family members in your building. But happily they flag that for us, although you can probably figure out from the fact that there's 100 adults in an address. But anyway, so it's a panel data, it's collected quarterly. Moreover, we get this data fairly quickly. They close the quarter and then we get the data like a couple months later. So we already have data through most of 2014, for example. We know what you know in a credit file, which is we don't know your gender, we don't know your race, anything like that. I don't even know your education level, but I do know when you were born, and what we're going to do is just assume that those who are age 18 are graduating from high school. Not all individuals get a credit file as soon as they turn 18 or graduate from high school, and so we're going to have to make some assumptions. One is that the high school we first observe you in is the high school you went to school in. This is actually fairly reasonable. Not a lot of people are moving out of state before they get a credit file. And then we're going to look at, in terms of dependent variables, the credit score, and also delinquency, any account 30-day delinquent, 90 days delinquent, and then auto loans 30 or 90 plus days delinquent. For most people in this age range, 18 to 22, it's going to be a credit card. They're going to have a credit card. I think the average number of accounts was 2.5, and usually it's 2 credit cards, or a credit card and an auto loan. Auto loan is the most common type of installment loan at this age. So that's why we're looking at those particular outcomes. Just to give you some basic summary statistics and give you a sense for the population. So, for example, looking here at Georgia, you see the average credit score relatively low, 606. But that makes sense, right? These are young people. Your credit score is primarily determined by the length of your credit history. your on-time payment history, and then your utilization rates. Well, if you have all of maybe a year or two of credit history, hopefully you've made all your payments on time, and you have a couple of $1,000 maybe in available credit, and you're using $500 a month or something. So you're not going to have a great credit score at this age. Basically, the only thing you can do is hurt your credit score by, for example, missing payments. So in general, relatively low credit scores across the board for synthetic control state, and then when we use Florida, you see number of accounts for in Georgia, 2 accounts on average, and relatively high rates of delinquency. About 15% of people experience a delinquency, about 15% of our observations have delinquency of 30 days, 18% 90 days at one point, or are in the 90-day delinquency. And then you can see the delinquency rates for auto loans as well. And then you see relatively similar numbers for Idaho here, slightly higher credit scores, slightly lower delinquency rates. And then for Texas, again, very similar credit scores to Georgia, and also similar delinquency rates.
These are all permanent addresses, so for college students who are going to school out of state.
They tend to report their parents' address for their, for credit purposes. At least that's my understanding. I don't think most people, if they're drawing addresses for their credit cards.
Although at some point they may, right? By the time you're a junior or something, you might be.
They might have an apartment. No, you're right. They might have an apartment and so on. But again, we use the very first observation. So if it is their parents' address when they first show up in terms of applying for a credit card, that's what we'll mark them as having gone to high school. So we're not too concerned with the out of states, people living out of state. So just to show you some trends in our dependent variables, you can just see that we track relatively well up to the line 2007 when the program was implemented. So these are basically the cohorts. And then you can see some divergence starting or some convergence starting after 2007. Blue is the treatment state, and then red is the synthetic control state. This is just, that was in terms of credit score. Here in terms of the 30-day delinquency, matching up much better than the 90-plus day delinquency, and fairly good match pre-implementation. So, well, I'm going through questions. I thought I was. Yes, I need to ask more questions. Thought I had enough slides for like an hour and 15 minutes, or an hour and a half.
Max, I was going to the previous slide.
Sure.
That sharp. So what's going on with this sort of sharp rise, 2010?
2009 delinquency. Lots lost their jobs.
That's just the
Financial crisis. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly there are national things occurring at this time where, that's why you see these huge jumps in delinquency occurring at this time period. People across the board are just having a tough time. There's also, the CARD Act was implemented at this time as well, which made it a little harder for college students, in theory, to get credit cards. But happily that was a national policy, so for state-to-state comparisons, it should affect them equally, and so we're not too concerned about the effect of the CARD Act, for example.
And since you're doing difference in difference, you don't really care that the levels are the same, you're just looking for sort of movement.
Yeah, that's right, changes in
they're moving together.
pre-post, yeah.
And that's all, those graphs are all records in the sample, so these aren't age adjusted or anything like that, right?
No, this is just raw comparisons of the cohorts.
I don't work in this field, so this might be really elementary for everyone else, but could you say something about what you know about what predicts these dependent variables you're looking at? Is income a major driver? I guess I'm trying to conceptualize what the causal model is you think might be at work here. Like, what is it that financial education would be affecting that would affect people's behavior such that we would see?
No, that's actually a very, very good question, and one we've been struggling with in terms of pitching this. So Michael, for example, I think that maybe it affects salience, or it keeps it's a reminder that you should pay your bills on time, for example. You actually remember, okay, my credit's important, paying my bills on time is important. But you think that would show up, when we get to our results, you think that show up more in 30 days, people avoid 30 days. We're actually seeing more of an effect on the 90-day side. So, is it just that people avoid getting into trouble in the first place? So that's much more my thing, like maybe they don't get a credit card and spend it all in one place, suddenly have 100% utilization of their credit card that they can't pay back, and then they just So maybe they just avoid the big mistakes front. Could be that they learn budgeting, and so they, just were more careful with their money in general. So we're actually, we don't know specifically what behavior this education is going to change. It's going to just be sort of what can we observe in terms of, okay, we're exposed to the education, do we actually even see anything in terms of changes in outcomes for the cohort exposed to financial education relative to cohorts not exposed to financial education?
But if we kind of think backwards, right, so you start with your outcomes, which is your credit score and your delinquency, what do we know about what's predictive of those? Like, what are the biggest drivers of those?
So employment, income, like you said. There's all sorts of individual behaviors that are related to credit scores. So obviously, if you're just more intelligent, highly educated, this age, obviously, there's only so much education you can have, but you're going to just do better in terms of credit outcomes. You're just going to be more, if you're more responsible overall. I'm sure there's a bunch of, like, what are shocks called? Child efficacy.
Yeah, but then there's shocks, which are.
Yeah, and then there's
Random.
yeah. Some are random, some are random.
So it seems like most of those are not things you would be expecting this intervention to affect.
Yeah, so the only way it should really change things is through changes in people's behavior. Like, or maybe people's, really it's going to be people's behavior that we're going to change here. Budgeting, planning, effectively using credit, those would be the pathways we'd expect it to change through. But it's hard to directly measure so these changes in behavior, observing those.
Are people encouraged in these curricula to make use of credit products, or are they sort of, do you get, the...
I don't know if encouraged is the right word. I think it's more explaining them and talking about responsible use of credit.
Like, are they scared off? In sex ed, they show you the pictures of the terrible outcomes, and they're like...
They don't show you
"This is
pictures of
somebody in
people
there."
broken on the street in the personal finance courses. No, I don't think so. I'm actually not sure what, they do differ in how they teach it. But usually budgeting is part of it. Michael can probably talk more to the details of it, but usually budgeting is part of it, explaining responsible use of credit, explaining what a credit score is and what determines a credit score. So those sorts of things.
I think budgeting and credits have this week.
So I don't know if they necessarily make any value judgments in terms of credit's good, credit's bad.
I'm just wondering if the intervention would change the likelihood of somebody showing up.
So that's a very valid concern, right? So if the fact that you receive financial education actually increases the probability that you actually apply for credit, we're going to have different sample composition, or decreases, right? We're going to have selection into our sample to begin with, given that it's only credit files, it's not full population. So we probably need to look more specifically at just our states, but my colleague Mia Brown, she's actually done some work showing that relative to sort of the share of the population from CPS, the implementation of financial education doesn't appear to affect the share of the population of that age group that actually shows up in the credit file. So it doesn't seem to be having a big enough effect in terms of relative to the share of the population. That doesn't seem to be changing over time. That said, it might be worth looking at our states specifically. If we're making the criticism that all these policies are different, then maybe we should still be more broadly looking at our states in particular would be a worthwhile exercise. Because this is a very valid concern, because that would actually be fundamental selection into our sample to begin with. All right, so in terms of the model, as was mentioned, we're doing a difference in difference model. Basically, we're just looking pre and post implementation of the education in, for example, Georgia, relative to pre and post implementation effects in Florida. So basically comparing the difference of these two cohorts, the Florida cohorts and then the Georgia cohorts. Another thing we're going to do that's slightly different, so we have our wide variable outcomes that I mentioned before, but we're also going to look at, we're not just going to do a pre and post time period, we're going to actually say, well, given the complexity of the implementation of these education programs, given that, Karen Holden said smart about how teachers aren't necessarily comfortable teaching financial education, they don't feel confident doing so. We might actually think that over time they'll get better at it. They'll, or might even just spread to more school districts. It might be that like 80% implemented the first year, but then the other 20% show up the next year. And so you might expect a bigger effect the longer it's been since it actually was implemented. in the state. And then we're going to have a bunch of other controls. Again, we're relatively limited in our demographic controls at the individual level in the credit panel data, but we are going to use the unemployment rate, number of quarters that an individual is actually in the credit data, some state fixed effects, and then number of credit accounts the individual has. We're also going to use quarter year fixed effects to capture some of the economic variation. So just looking at the first set of results. So this is for the synthetic control estimation for Georgia. So we see exactly what I thought might happen, which was first year, in terms of credit score, no effect, right? Just basically a null positive, well, a null effect, not significant. But then we move to the second year and you see a 13-point bump credit score, keeping in mind that this is off a base of 611 in Georgia prior to implementation. So a non-trivial increase in credit score, and then by the third year, it more than doubles, going to 28.7 points. And again, you see the same thing in terms of pattern for delinquency. Georgia's our best state in terms of like a clear pattern showing exactly what we want. We see a small decrease in delinquency to the 30-day in the first year. Moving to the second year, increases substantially, about a half percentage point decrease in delinquency, and then by the third year, a 1.5 percentage point decrease in delinquencies from base, like I said, of 15%. And then moving to 90-day delinquency, again, you see this not a very small effect in the first year, and then moving to 2 points, and then 3.5 points by the third year. And then, again, similar for auto delinquencies.
Yeah, for a second. Sure. When you say first year, second year, third year, are you talking cohort?
That's right.
Or years beyond the education?
So for the cohort, so the 2007 cohort, 2008 cohort, 2009 cohort. So they were exposed 3 years post-implementation, 2 years post-implementation, after it was just implemented.
And so do you have any way of accounting for, I take the education, it takes a while to sink in, it takes a while for opportunities to present themselves for me to have credit behavior, so there's an effect a year after I take it, 2 years after I take it, or 3 years after I take it?
So, so the way we're dealing with that is, one of the reasons why we're looking at an intervention that occurred in 2007 is that gives us, for our latest cohort, 2009 cohort, we only look at these people for 18 to 22. So for example, in the 2007 cohort, I have data on them going past age 22. But for the sake of keeping the comparison group similar, we cut people off at age 22. So we're only going to observe, so everyone's going to have the same amount of exposure in our data set, that is, we see them for 4 years or 16 quarters at most, assuming you get a credit file right at 18. And so,
These results are all the average over those 16, up to 16.
yes, these are the averages over, these are the average effects over those, basically that range of years, so you're young adult years for that cohort, compared to the 18 to 22 for the 2008 cohort or the 2006 cohort.
So if I'm understanding correctly, so you're saying that P1, P2, P3, so P3 went through the education in the middle of the financial crisis or something like that?
They did, so they would have graduated in 2009.
So there's potentially a salience, I mean, there are a lot of possibilities here, right? Yeah, I just.
You're right, so it could have been, so the first cohort, 2007, economy's good, personal finance.
Right, so it's not the schools aren't getting better, the curriculum's not getting better,
It might
it's
be
nothing
the
like
students
that,
care
it's
more.
just,
It could be the students care more.
things are different. Now, do you have, I can't remember what controls you have in.
Relatively minimal in terms of, again, we don't know much about the individuals, so then.
Right, but you have like unemployment, right? So you're controlling sort of for what's
I mean, the
going on in
quarter
the economy
fixed
to
effects, yeah.
some extent. So that might help isolate that it could be it's more relevant, potentially, I don't know.
Yeah, so, yeah, I'm trying to think of the fact that it's national versus, so, I mean, the kids in Florida were also, thinking financial education pretty salient. At the same time, granted, they weren't like necessarily exposed to a course where they
Right,
were
they would
like,
have had to seek it out on their own or
that's
something.
right, or pay attention when it was on TV, I don't know what TV show teaches you financial education.
You don't know when they received the intervention though. So your 2007 and 2009 cohorts could have taken the same class at the same time, right? One when they were a sophomore and one when they were a senior.
Well, the,
You know when they graduated. you
yes,
don't
yeah, we know when they graduate, well, we know approximately when they graduated. We don't, you're right, it could have been that they were a junior and they took the senior economics course. That's absolutely true.
So is that true? So do you know, you looked at it, because some schools, right, have a particular, you take this when you're a junior, right? You take it when, whatever, but that's
a good
not the
question.
case.
I mean, I think in general they were, this is a senior course. But I should
You
check
could find out just to see.
if it was something where they had flexibility in terms of when they could take the courses.
And is this a statewide graduation requirement?
Yeah.
So every graduating senior at some point that.
Had to take this economics course. In 2 of the states, they actually were tested. It was potentially on the graduation test, testing requirements for graduation.
Would you expect the effects to be the same for like 19-year-olds versus 22-year-olds? I mean, would there be more time?
So, I expect the effect to be the same.
It seems like
Like if you
if you're
didn't
18,
have-
everybody looks kind of the same, you don't have much history, then over time
I
you
mean, it's
have more.
possible, I mean, it takes you 1 month to miss your first payment, right? So,
I mean, you could look just to see at age 22 are these cohorts.
right, instead of averaging over,
You could just take 1 quarter when they're 22.
right.
But it would also just be interesting to see if there's an effect. You know, you might expect the effect of an intervention to be big right away and then peter out, or
That
it
could be,
takes
yeah.
some time, you know, and so seeing, not just averaging across ages, but seeing what things look like at, you know, if you average across the 4 quarters when they're 19, 20, 21, and 22, and seeing if there
That's
are
good.
trends in any direction.
That's a good possible.
But you also have people entering the sample, am I right? So if they don't have a credit report when they're 18, but have it when they're 19, they
They'll
have
show
their.
up. If they were 18 in 2007, yeah, they'll part of that cohort.
So then you could draw them differently, and you could say first year, you know, first
Yeah,
4
we
quarters,
include-
4 quarters.
We don't include, we include the number of quarters we observed with the credit files, you know, your exposure in terms of chances of delinquency.
But kind of comparing your years.
Yeah, but the specific years, yeah, no, that's an interesting way to do it. Yeah, we hadn't thought of that. Georgia. All right, so Idaho, so here we see something a little odd, which is in the first year, they actually seem to have a negative effect. Now, I can certainly come up with plausible explanations here, like the teachers did such a bad job the first year that they actually like confused the students and did all sorts of horrible credit things. But what's funny is it shows up across the board, right? So it shows up in higher delinquencies as well. So something went funny that first year. But happily by the second year, it looks like they're recovering, a little 2-point bump in the credit score, and then by the third year, again, 6.5-point bump. Keeping in mind that Idaho was also the less rigorous one. It was the half-semester course, and it didn't have the part of the high school graduation testing requirement. So we don't really see anything in terms of 30-day delinquency. We do see an effect, though, on 90-day delinquency. Although again, magnitude smaller than it was for Georgia. And then again, seeing something in terms of auto delinquency, it does again increase in magnitude as years pass, yeah.
Can you put the 6 points or 16 points of your credit score in some kind of context? Like if I missed
Sure.
a payment, how bad would that hurt my credit score if I had done it on a 20-year-old?
So it's not, so it's sort of, there's so many factors that go in. I don't know what the average drop, it's pretty big for even one missed payment.
Especially the first.
Yeah, so it would probably be more than 20 points, or, I mean, I don't know, for these particular, I don't know what it would do.
They have such thin files, it might not take much to make it.
It would be bad, regardless, it would be bad. So this is,
So this is like preventing 1 out of every 10 people from doing one of those bad things
Yeah.
that would drop at 60 points.
that would do it. Or just, and it actually, like, utilization rate, like just them racking up less, using their credit cards less, would probably make a few point difference. I mean, again, it's just, it doesn't take much at this age to really move your credit score.
Okay.
And then Texas, here again, we see some small odd effects in the first year, but then moving to the second year, again, we see 5-point bump in your credit score, 13-point bump in your credit score. Again, nothing on 30-day delinquencies, but we are seeing it out 90+ day delinquencies. And again, magnitude increases over time, so we get up to 3.3% percentage point decrease third year out off that base of 15.9%. Then again, you see declines in auto delinquency, at least at 30-day. There's just very few 9+ day delinquencies on autos. So hard to see the effect there. So just, again, synthetic controls, relatively novel method. So what we did is we also did this, just picked a border state and did a comparison. And you see actually very similar results. So for Georgia here, nothing in the first year, 6-point bump second year, 11-point bump in the third year. Again, declines in 30-day delinquency and 9+ day delinquencies, increase in magnitude over time. So still seeing the effects there. I'm using this model. Then again, in Idaho, see the same funny thing in the first year, 8-point bump in the second year, 16-point bump in the third year. Again, declines in delinquency for 30 to 90+ days.
Max, can you just put in plain English what a border sample means?
So this is again where we just picked, okay, Georgia and Florida, maybe they're similar. I know they're not, but I mean, if you're from Georgia or Florida, you probably don't think so, but, this is very common in literature. This was basically just we can do a better one where we just look at school districts, for example, on the border, which is one thing we're going to look at doing. But basically we picked adjacent states, which may be similar on numerous demographic characteristics you might expect are moving, has a similar trend pre-intervention. And so we pick these states, like so for example Florida, and say, okay, so Florida and Georgia were trending similarly in terms of credit score for this age cohort prior to 2007 implementation of this, and there was a divergence. We'd expect a divergence after. So they were trending. So they had a similar trend before, then there's an intervention. So we're going to compare the change in Georgia to Florida, rather than this change in Georgia to the synthetic combination of states. So again, just a robustness check basically of our synthetic controls method.
So Idaho is in the sample, correct?
Sorry?
Idaho is in the sample?
Idaho is one of the treatment states. And then, so Georgia, Idaho, and Texas were the treatment ones, and then comparison states. We have the full set of comparison states, but on the map, the ones we picked up was comparison states.
So just on your slide right there, P3 credit score, your border sample did better than the treatment state, quite significantly?
No. So this is the effect in Texas. So relative to, I think it was New Mexico here for this comparison. So post-implementation, Texas cohort had a 30-point jump in their credit score. Or the difference, so the pre-post difference for Texas relative to the pre-post difference for New Mexico was 30 points.
In that case, the post is the third cohort after, and the pre is an average of like 8 or so cohorts before.
It's an average of, yes, that's correct.
Like 2000 through 2007.
That's right. So the comparison is, yes, we're not, I don't think we did 1 year pre, 2 year pre, 3 year pre. We didn't do that, no. We just amalgamated the pre's. So it is, so you're right, it is relative to all pre, entire pre period. Were you thinking there's like a expectation?
No, just a clarifying question.
No. It could be that in anticipation people change their behavior, or the fact that the state passed it, even if it was 2 years before it showed up in the class, they actually thought, oh, financial education is more important. I'll teach my kids financial education.
Yeah. Well, I think the slightly more unique thing about it is that it's leaving out those into two earlier years of treatment. So each time you're comparing year 1 to all the previous years.
Yes,
year 2 to all the
that's correct.
I mean, that's essentially the regression.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. Yes. So one other thing we did, just sort of to compare it to some of the previous literature where you used, instead of the implementation year, instead of what would happen if we pretend that the treatment occurred the year that the legislature passed this mandate, or this was passed but not necessarily implemented into the schools. Well, so for example, here in Georgia, we get a 6-point bump in the first year, 10-point bump from the passage, not the implementation in classrooms. And so you see a relatively flat effect, doesn't increase over time. And then we seem to get some reduction, a small reduction in delinquency, nothing really by the third year. Again, it looks like there's something for the 90 days, and then very small, what appear to be small, significant effects for the auto loan. So even just using the mandate year here, you seem to see at least some effect, or it looks like there's some effect. Now, at least in Georgia, moving to Idaho, here's we get what we would hope to see from the mandate year, which is it actually has a negative effect. It seems that if you use the implementation year, you get a negative. In the first, second, and third year, and it's increasing. Don't really see much in terms of effect on delinquency nearly across the board. So this is again using when the state passed it as opposed to when it actually showed up in the schools. So just to give you a sense for if you were using this estimation or using that as the treatment point, how your results would look. Here again, it looks kind of funny. You get jumping around. First year seems to be a modest effect, then like a 1-point effect and a 3-point effect. Again, you get this reduction in delinquency in the first year and then nothing after that. So just a lot of jumping around, not the pattern we expected in terms of increasing as time passed. It's just there's jumping around. The significance levels vary somewhat over time. So just less consistent and clean story when you use this implementation date rather than the treatment date. And so, just to briefly summarize, so we find some evidence that rigorous personal finance education mandates do in fact have an effect on early life delinquency and credit scores. Again, we just want to emphasize with this analysis that not all state education mandates or their personal finance education programs are created equal. Different states do things differently in the classroom. We want to emphasize that if well done, it appears that a personal finance education course actually does yield significant improvements in financial behavior, or at least some financial behaviors that affect your credit score, delinquency rates. But again, we don't know the exact mechanism that this is operating through, nor do we know if these effects persist naturally. And again, to the point about just looking year by year, it might be that this is all showing up in age 18, 19, and they forget about age 20. So it might be even shorter term than we're looking. Then again, this is going to, happily we can continue to look at this as we get more data in a credit panel and additional years post-treatment. And then with that, I'm happy to take 5 minutes of questions and then make sure everyone gets out on time. A little faster than I expected.
So can you remind me of your timing of this? For the bulk of your study, what years would the students be in high school getting this class? Because what I'm concerned about is, you did control for some extraneous variables. I'm concerned about the impact of the Great Recession in the sense of, okay, what was happening in their world around them as they were hearing about money?
Right. So, no, just like Elizabeth's point, it might have been much more salient to the 2009 cohort or even 2008 cohort. Probably 2008, depending on what they were taking it. But you're right, it might have been that they were paying more attention in 2009 because Mandel was long outside. So what we do is we look at the timing. So basically, they're in high school the 4 years. So we have the first cohort, 2007. So they would have been in high school 2006, 2007, 2005, 2006, 2004, 2005, 2003, 2004. And then just move it 1 year forward for the 2008 cohort, 2009 cohort. And then, yeah. So those would be the years they were in school. So you're absolutely right. There's the last cohort certainly is affected by it. They're in school during the financial crisis, and maybe selling into more so.
So what I'm wondering about is that there are a variety of reports that talk about how this generation of young people, sort of 25 and under, is far more conservative in their outlook about investing and things like that. And their idea of investing is everything in a CD or something because it's safe. And I'm just wondering if your third cohort here really is skewing the results in a sense, because all of a sudden they're just simply more careful, more cautious, because the world's a scary financial place, and that might include either not taking out credit, not taking out too much, or paying your bills on time because of what you're saying, the salience of what's going on. I'm just wondering how you can tease that out.
So we are comparing them to the same cohort in other states. So even if it is that financial crisis made the education more salient, The only difference, at least in theory, the only difference is they got the education, whereas the other class didn't. So it might be that it's still the education, except it also happened to coincide. So maybe the effect isn't quite as big, but we still see an effect in the second year that's relatively large in magnitude, so we'll jump to Georgia 30 points. So it might be that we get these huge jumps, for Georgia and Texas, well, not huge for Texas, but we get reasonably sized bumps in the third year. It might be that, right, maybe 3 points of that is the salience from the financial crisis happening around me. I actually paid attention to my personal finance course. But again, keep in mind what they're teaching, which is budgeting and something about credit. It might be that, so it's quite possible that sort of just the cohort is scarred and more conservative, but presumably that be fairly consistent across states at least. So I'm not sure how that would interact exactly with the financial education. Yeah.
I was wondering, you know something about their address, right?
Yes.
Do you have like
That's
a
the
zip
chart.
code?
That's a
The census? Okay, so I was thinking it might be really interesting to see variation if your treatment is not just the whole state, but higher income census tracts.
We tried
and lower
that.
income, you don't see any,
I don't
there
recall,
are different effects.
I don't think we saw anything depending on the income level.
Or education level.
Yeah, that's right, we did education and income. I think we might have even tried race as well. We might have seen something about race, but I can't remember. I don't know what the effect of it was. But yeah, in general, nothing for income or education. But I don't know what level we did that track or zip code. No, better track, okay, listen.
So for the graphs you showed early on, it looks like how hard hit the state is by the recession is just going to be an important part of the results here. And so you're using
Unemployment.
in 2000 to match states. I mean, I wonder if it would make some sense to like use some later characteristics.
To match on 2010.
Yeah, or sort of how big the housing bubble was between 2000 and later to potentially.
So that's a
see
good
how
point. So
it-
instead of trying, so see if we use 2010 characteristics or other characteristics, that we get a different match in terms of synthetic control. Could be. Yeah, it's certainly possible if they're getting.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like your results are driven a lot by how big the spike is in delinquencies in 2009 in one group versus another group.
Yeah, I mean, you saw that it was fairly.
I mean, they both have big spikes, right? And
Yeah.
just one's a little taller.
I mean, this is again, so Georgia, Idaho, Texas. So we see this across the board that people have pretty big shocks in both our synthetic state and our treatment states, and across states like Texas did a lot better than all the other states and still had a rough time. At least the 18 to 22-year-olds in Texas had a rough time, similar to Georgia. Let's see the scales. So Idaho had a little, didn't have quite as big a spike as Georgia and Texas, but a bit of an outlier compared to those states in a number of ways. But sorry, so did you have just
yeah,
try and matching on different?
Yeah, I mean,
factors,
it's
see
just
if
if
that
people
affects.
are worried to some degree that, hey, this is just a different response to the recession story, if you include a characteristic like, how big was the housing bubble between 2000 and 2007 or something in the States is one of the characteristics you match on.
Right. No, so we can try that.
So, Max, in your discussion slides, you said, if well done, the education seems to make a difference. So did you dig into what well done looks like?
So these are states we consider to be well done, where they actually required it be taught in the schools, and they actually provided some teacher training, and they in two cases actually put it, you could be tested on this in order to graduate, so you might want to pay attention and actually study this stuff, as opposed to, yeah, there's something on the books, but you don't actually have to teach in your schools. You may or may not offer this course, and students may or may not take it. So that's actually fairly common. You have states where there's something on the books, but school districts aren't required to teach it, and students aren't required to take it even if they do offer it. So we consider that a fairly mild treatment versus this where it's in the class, you need to take this to graduate, we're going to test you on it, we're going to train your teachers to actually teach this to you properly. So these states are considering more rigorous implementations.
Did you see like commonalities in the test questions up to a certain level?
So we did not look at the test questions. We didn't go to that level of detail.
So safe to assume you didn't look at curriculum either.
No, that actually we do, to the extent that we can get some information on the model curriculum. Now, it's not necessarily what the school board used in that district, but it's at least what the state might produce something as a, like, here's a template. You guys can use this if you want.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, if you had 3 states that did something roughly similar to produce, this kind of result, that's one thing. If you had 3 states that did very different things and you still got this result, that tells you something different as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, we're sort of looking at the level of detail we can in terms of, clearly they're required to take this, they were going to be tested on it, these state requirements, and the broader things states did. But, so we're hopefully saying that this package, we can at least say this package, this general package of sort of mandates seems to have an effect.
Did you apply the exact same methods to other states that had the milder reforms?
No, we didn't look at any of the milder states. Yeah, no, I mean, that'd be a good comparison.
Just like pretend.
If we get a small, yeah, no, that's a good.
Comparison.
Yeah, no, we haven't done that. Maybe they expect that we'd see much smaller effects. I mean, even in IWC, you see a smaller effect here, and it's slightly less rigorous, so. Any additional questions? Otherwise, I think we're right on time.
All right, try anything, Matt.
Thank you very much.